Satyadasa, who, yeah, very, very pleased we've got Satyadasa here, who is going to be interviewed by Kamalamati. So you may have met Kamalamati. So Kamalamati's here, part of the Cambridge Sangha. So very, very pleased we've got Kamalamati who has read and loved Satyadasa's book. But yeah, particularly obviously wanting to welcome Satyadasa. We used to live in Cambridge together about 20 years ago, something like that. And I have not read Satyadasa's book, so I am delighted to be here too. But my mum has. My mum has, and she loved it. And it was really interesting what she said, actually. She said it gave her a window into my world that she'd never had any other way. And I thought that was a really, really striking thing. So there's something about the book that speaks very deeply and very directly to you, whether you're Buddhist, whether you're non-Buddhist. So thank you for that. That's a real sort of gift to me. Yeah. So I thought I'd start with that, and I'll hand over to Kamalamati to interview you.
Thanks, Siddhi. Yeah, welcome everyone. I'm so honoured and delighted to have been asked to do this. I first came across Satyadasa with his lawyer hat on, actually, at the beginning of lockdown, when he was recommended, and he does come highly recommended. I'll get the commission.
No, don't do that.
No. Anyway, he did my will and my power of attorney work for me, and I found him very approachable, very straightforward, very efficient, and I thank you for
the book's just a lost leader for my law stuff. So yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Anyway, I hope you don't mind me mentioning that
no.
bit of you. Yeah, so I'd had a bit of contact with Satyadasa, and then when I heard about him writing this book, I watched him being interviewed by no other than Maitreya Bandhu at the LBC, and I was just so moved and taken by it. I immediately wanted to buy the book. In fact, I bought 2 copies of the book straight away, thinking, oh, this is something that I'm sure I'm going to want to give to friends as gifts. And that's how it's been for me as well, because I've just been reading it. I've read it about 3 times myself now, and been recommending it to everyone. And I really recommend it. It's beautifully written. It's got humour in it, and it's also very, very. It's got a lot of depth to it. It tells Satyadasa's story it's just marvelous, really. I'm a bit lost for words, but he's not lost for words in the book. So do get the book and do read it. And what we're going to do is we're just going to talk about, sort of explore a bit through the book, particular points in the book that will give you a flavour if you haven't read it. And if you have read it, well, you can hear a bit more from Satyadasa, like from the horse's mouth, which would be lovely. And we'll have until about 10 past the hour, before our tea break at 20 past. And so at about 5 past, we have to keep an eye on the time. We'll invite you, if you've got any questions, including people on Zoom, and if you've got anything to ask Satyadasa about what he's been talking about. But just to say that, yeah, I mean, Satyadasa is described in the blurb on the book as a lawyer, health coach, and the Buddhist tutor at Eton College. And he also leads classes at the LBC. So they're some of the things that he's doing these days. But along the way, he's been on quite a journey, I'd say. His name means a servant of the truth. And he was ordained in 2011 by Ratna Ghosha, no other than Ratna Ghosha, who was our chair here, wasn't he, for a number of years. So we know him quite well. And you also had very close connection at the LBC, didn't you, with Maitreya Bandhu, who's of course a good friend of ours, comes here every so often, and Jnanavacha, who's our president here at Cambridge. So yeah, just sort of linking up a few people there. So the book opens with Satyadasa's birth, and then goes on to talk about his childhood and his family. And it's a very interesting story, very moving, but it's got, as I said, a lot of humour in it, which is delightful. I think the way he writes, I was asking him earlier if it's the way he writes is to do with some journalism training that he had, because he's not only become all those other things, he's also a trained journalist. But he says, no, it's not really anything to do with that. And anyway, you can say what you want about that. But yeah, do start.
Well, I was just going to read a first bit just to get us into the, so then, yeah, I mean, I was a journalist, and, you know, I wasn't a journalist for long, but I was also trained as a lawyer. So when I started writing my memoirs, I started sort of telling everybody what the case was, you know, and sort of putting out my theories about life with a thin veneer of some stuff that I'd done on top of it. And it quickly occurred to me that kind of writing was boring. It was boring to me on the third reading. It would have been awful for other people, you know, where you're just sort of in a didactic mode, and it seems a bit, there's something not right about it. So I gradually got down to writing more and more simply about my life and trying to tell my story as personally and as I could. So and that meant I had to start talking about my hand. And I'll start with that. The first chapter. Something was missing from the start. Dad bumped into another expectant father in the hospital corridor. "What news?" said the man. "We have a lovely baby boy," Dad replied, but the midwife had introduced me to the world by thrusting my arm in front of Mum's face, but he's not got his left hand. The man had whiskey and poured them both a glass. Everyone was doing their bit. Dad's father, a farmer, broke from his daily rounds to shout some words down the phone to his son. "Never mind, we'll love him twice as much." 10 years earlier, the drug thalidomide had caused multiple limb deficiencies in thousands of children. So while Mum was sedated, I was examined for ailments more sinister than an absent hand. Every blemish was a harbinger of possible problems ahead. Mum's parents, Grandpa and Nana, were only allowed a quick look in. As they sat in the waiting room, a poem came to Grandma, which she wrote up on a nurse's attendance sheet. "His small grey face, but 12 hours here, bears mysteries stranger than the seas, in hieroglyphics more austere and older far than Ramesses." Setting events against a mythological backdrop would surely help. After 9 days, the doctors confirmed it was a congenital birth defect, which is a fancy way of saying they didn't know what caused it. My parents took me home, filled with overwhelming love and anxious sorrow. At the primary school where he was deputy head, Dad found himself repeating, "He's a lovely baby boy, but," to a stream of colleagues expecting happy news. Mum was a classroom teacher at the same school. They didn't want the whole thing to be about the hand, but as for me, I fitted right in. Newborn babies can't do much, however many hands they have. We lived in Banstead, Surrey, in a steep row of semi-detached houses with tight little porches and lead-lined bay windows. Our cortina sat out front on the crazy paving. My awareness grew from the milky, undefined realm of supermarket trolley seat and playpen to include reference to a little hand, which accompanied my journeys around the house. I expected to see it there, not realizing it was any less than a person might want, even though my younger sister popped out with 2. My little hand became part of the family, a feature like Dad's chin dimple, which I could poke through his beard, or Mum's long dark hair, which was hard to straighten, or our Labrador's big brown nose. In truth, little hand overstates it a bit. There are small nodes across where the knuckles would have been, but these are only fingers in an archaeological sense, like the worn away remnants of an Iron Age fort. Stump would be more accurate, but who the hell wants a stump? Anyway, so that's the first bit.
So that sets the scene, doesn't it, for us? And I think you can get a flavour there of the way Satyadasa writes his story. Yeah, continues. Can you tell us a bit more about Grandpa? It was Grandpa that wrote the poem or came up with the poem about Ramesses.
Yeah. Well, my grandfather was. He was one of the things that I tried to do in the book was to kind of tell my family story, and fortuitously, my family story had a connection to the story of Buddhism because my grandfather was very involved in the early Buddhist scene, even from the 1950s. He was involved in the early phase of people becoming interested and having groups in their front rooms and talking about Zen and Tao and the Vedanta and all these kind of exciting things that were then becoming available. There was no Sangha like we have today, obviously. But
and it was in Cheam.
It was in Cheam, which is a kind of funny place to talk about, Cheam, if you know Cheam. It was a Hancock's Half Hour, was in East Cheam, and they lived in East Cheam, actually. Yeah, so he was involved in that, and it transpired that over when I was a mitra, so when I was made a mitra shortly after I stopped living in Cambridge. I was 23. I was living at the London Buddhist Centre, living with Prasanna Vera when I became a mitra, and I went back to my grandmother's house, which was still the same house, and my grandfather was no longer alive. But I said, I'm living at the London Buddhist Centre, Nana. And she said, oh yes, how is Sangharakshita? And I said, well, I couldn't believe it. Is that coming out my grandmother's mouth? This is like, how is Sangharakshita? I didn't find out until after I'd written the book that the reason why she called him Sangharakshita was she didn't like to use the word shitta. She didn't like to see Sangharakshita. So they'd politified it. Yeah, he came to their house in 1964 at the invitation of my grandfather. He met my mother when my mum was 17 in that house where I kind of grew up around that house. Didn't actually live in it, but we went there all the time. And it led to me finding a paper by Vasantra in my mum's old bedroom and pictures of Bhante in the front garden with the English Sangha Trust and things like that. So it was a really strange. So in a way, I've kind of told my grandfather's story, honouring in a way the origins of Buddhism in the West, you know, to use a grand sort of way of putting it, but just through this rather strange little East Cheam Eastern philosophy group, which was very eccentric, very heady. Yeah,
and your granddad was quite a character.
He was quite an eccentric sort of fellow. Yeah, he was a difficult man. My mother really had a very negative view. I'm glad I'm pleasing mothers now. This is good, but it didn't please my mother, me becoming a Buddhist at all, because she thought she'd got rid of all of that when she left home, because her grandfather, not just Buddhism, but kind of almost like Heidegger, David Hume, but the Buddha was a big one, and Alan Watts, and all of these people, who was a Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti was a family favorite. And Douglas Harding, if these names mean anything, but my mother just kind of saw it as all intellectual claptrap, basically, because it didn't give her anything that she wanted. And my grandfather was just obsessed. He was a very obsessive man, you know, and he was obsessed with this book that he was writing on, you know, the way of all things, you know, why not start out? So
what was that book called?
It's called The Philosophy and Practice of Meditation, an Existential Ontological Guide to Contemplative Experience.
I'm sure we've all read it.
If you think that's bad, you should start reading it. And actually, it's got some gems in it, but it's lost in that mode of that I was trying to avoid in the book, which was a mode that I recognized that I could get into, kind of like trying to sum up the way of all things. And you know, there's some lovely bits in it, but it's quite abstruse. Yeah.
And didn't you go back years later and found it in the British Library?
Yeah, at the end of the book, I described going back and trying to find this copy, and sort of feeling sad actually, because it was his, you know, to me, he was my grandfather. I kind of loved. I don't know whether I loved him, but he was a very eccentric man. I won't go into all the things that are described in the book, but you know, in a way, he did have he was genuinely moved by the Dharma, by this vision of something, my mum didn't know that.
Mm.
That didn't show up to her at all.
Mm.
And he went about it in a way which I don't know whether it was helpful to him even.
Right.
But
it had a
it
big
was real.
impact on the family.
It had a big impact on the family, and I've come to recognize that it was a real path that he was on. He didn't have a Sangha. He didn't, that wasn't as developed as it is now.
No.
He built himself to the top of his own little,
Sort
he
of
had his own
empire
students,
almost.
and there was all kinds of shenanigans. Yeah.
Yeah.
Less said about that.
Interesting story.
Yeah.
But there's a little scene where you talk about him going to some meeting and your mum and her brother sitting outside and just hoping for sweets or something.
Yeah, there was all
Wasn't
kinds of
there?
people. That was in
know.
Worcester Park, you know,
Yeah.
and they'd go and they'd talk to this guy above a sweet shop, and they'd talk about the nature of reality above this sweet shop with this guy who owned the sweet shop.
And your mum and her
Yeah,
brother
my
were just
grandfather
hoping
thought
they
he was a
might
kind of
get-
guru, and they were wanting the sweets, obviously, as you do. But yeah,
Yeah. Oh,
but yeah.
good.
So that's
Oh, and what did your nana say about Sangharakshita?
oh
What
yeah.
was her impression of Sangharakshita?
Well, she said he had funny teeth.
Yeah.
That was all she could
That's
remember.
all she could remember.
And he did.
Yeah.
He did.
Yeah.
That was agreed. He was talking on a Nat man and arguing with a Hindu there who was taken up a contrary position.
Right.
Yeah. But I mean, what I wanted to start with the book was my hand, really, and kind
Yeah.
of to sort of start exploring that as something that was something when I was growing up that I guess I dealt with it in the way that my parents first taught me to deal with it, which was a good way. Which was basically saying, you're the same as everybody else. You know, you can get on, you're fine. They make adjustments. Obviously, certain things needed to be done to my, you know,
You
help
had
me.
some surgery, didn't you?
Oh, I had a little bit of surgery to just free up this thumb,
Yeah.
which was very useful actually, to have a little gap.
Hmm.
Don't knock it. That's a very useful little gap.
Mind the gap.
Mind the gap, yeah. But there was some, you know, alterations that made. I had a piece of cutlery that was a fork and a spoon and a knife all in the right hand. It wasn't a good fork or a good spoon or a good knife. That was the problem with it. But, you know, those were things that you just do. You know, it's not actually that big a deal having one hand in many ways, practically speaking. Of course, socially, I had to kind of find a way to reconcile myself to it. And it was like, you're normal, you're fine, just nothing really, you know, why should it be a problem? Which is quite natural. That's what, we're all just people, right? So that's a natural instinct. But of course, it wasn't quite true, because I had this thing, and I'm sure we all have something in our lives, you know, that could be comparable to this, if it's not visible, or it's from our conditions or our sense of our background or something about us. But so I had to sort of deal with the awareness of that. That was underneath. I wasn't ever able to make it explicit. So because of the way I wasn't, people didn't tend to ask me questions about it. Even when I got into my teens, people wouldn't. It's something like I built a little, I'm okay, don't fuss me about it. You know, it's cool. You know, I'd go to parties, and of course I got into habits of sort of hiding, you know, because you just want to fit in. So all those instincts were in me, and nobody would kind of say much about it. And occasionally a brave adult would puncture through and say, how'd that happen then? You know, what, that must be difficult or something. But I can't remember any, like there's situations I've been in my life where people don't even know how it happened, because I didn't speak about it. And of course it did make me feel at a deficit. So I was quite competitive and quite,
I was going to ask you about that, because you give a story about tying shoelaces.
Yes.
And how you're quite young, but you were the quickest in your class to learn to tie a shoelace.
Yeah. As I said, because I had a consultant pediatrician and no one else in the class
Teaching
did.
you.
That was the case. But it'd be more like, you know, like my using like sewing. We used to sew. I don't know whether people do that now. You know, used to sew, but I used to try and sew my sampler quicker than anyone else when I was 7. Never cross stitch, back stitch. But yeah, I mean, we all use what facilities we have, right? When we're kids, you know, if you're bright, you exploit that. If you're good at running, you exploit that. So I exploited the things that I was good at. And I guess I had this feeling that I had to be better than everyone else in order to sort of catch up with them. And I had this growing sense of there was a part of my life which was a difficulty. And I think there was a definite moment when I realized, and I was in about 8 or 9, I was being bullied at that stage. So this is probably why it came into my mind. I can't solve this problem. This is an unsolvable problem at that level, which was quite a heavy realization. And I didn't tell my parents, I didn't talk to people about it. It was just this thing, I've got this thing. I can't, when you're 9, you can't see being old. It doesn't mean anything. You just sort of, so I was just stuck with that feeling that I can't change this. This is something that's never going to change. Oh dear.
And how do you think that then affected you as you went through secondary education and into college and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I leaned on my sort of strengths, and I thought at one point, if I got into Oxford and I studied law, everything would be okay. I'd get the recognition, and the women would start finding me very attractive, that kind of stuff, that stuff you think about. Yeah, so I sort of carried on, but it wasn't really until I was practicing Buddhism, but not just starting practicing. I think I became involved in Triratna, then FWBO, around 1997, and so when I was 22, and I shortly lived in the London Buddhist Centre for about 6 years, between 23 and 29, in one of the communities, Sanavera for some of that time. And yeah, I remember I was about 28 or 29, and I was on the tube one day, and I saw this guy who had a hand like mine, and I immediately instinctively wanted to hide my hand, so I sort of put it under my book, and I felt, oh God, I hope he doesn't come up and say hello. I don't want to talk to him about this. And that was kind of interesting, 7 years of meditation practice, and there was this thing that I just didn't want to kind of I didn't really, and this exposure, like being exposed, some area of vulnerability in the system. I don't want it to be exposed. I don't want to have to talk about it. I'd never really spoken to another person who had the same thing at that point.
And was it around that time you decided to go on this activity holiday and take some children that had also?
Yes, that was a very moving thing. I realized that I had to sort of look at it a bit more, because what's Dharma practice if you're just not going to just look at ordinary things in your life? There was always this thing, some Jnanavaccha once mentioned to me, did I get into Dharma practice because of my hand? Was that the kind of fly in the ointment? If we all need a fly in the ointment. And I was really resentful of that implication. No, I'm bloody good at, I know about Dharma. Look at the books I've read, look at, I'm inspired by this and that. And, there's a lot of truth in that. And in a way, I don't kind of conclude about whether this was what drove me into Dharma practice or not, but it was certainly part of the strong conditioning aspects of my life. So
there's a good little bit where, can I find that bit, where Jnanavaccha and you had an exchange.
We had many exchanges.
Yeah. Page 145 it starts, really, yeah. At the bottom. Would you read that little bit?
Whatever the meaning of it all. That one.
Perhaps it doesn't start very well just there, does it? But as you, whenever you were in Jnanavaccha's
Peter said to me at one point, you seem to have a basic positivity. He was talking about my life, and I guess I had a very happy life in growing up. This is not a misery memoir. No. I had a happy, blessed childhood with wonderful, wonderful conditions in so many ways. But he said, you seem to have a basic positivity, but I wonder if your missing hand is the factor which gave you enough suffering to push you onto the spiritual path. Maybe, I don't know, I replied. I was resistant to the idea that I was a Buddhist because of my missing hand. It's not the only factor. I'm just saying, he sort of, you could see I was a bit sensitive, but without that, you might have been a lawyer by now. And I said, well, thank God for my missing hand. Anyway. But yes, so that factor, and I went on this, with sort of met these, I went on a week-long activity week, did 2 of them actually, with children who all had one or both hands missing, or sometimes, arm you know. And so there were all the adult helpers also had that same thing. So there was about 40 of us, and there was less than 40 hands between us. And that was very touching to see, just to see children, you know, opening the jam jar at breakfast, or managing their tray, and abseiling, and just being children. And yet I could suddenly see, oh, that's what I look like. This is ungainly thing. And I saw the frustration in some of the boys in particular. Not all of them, they were all quite different, but you know, you've got this body which is otherwise great, and you just want to play football, you just want to go out and canoe, but you've got this funny thing in your body that is like mucking it all up. And you could see that kind of frustration that built up in some of the boys. It's into a kind of a rage about something. You know, I recognize that. I didn't get into sort of rage, but that sort of, yeah, that dukkha, I guess. It's dukkha, isn't it?
Though, didn't
that
you?
was later, yeah.
Later on.
Yeah, no.
Shall we talk about that?
No, let's not. Save something.
Okay, well, what should we go on?
I know you
next?
can.
So you lived in the you at college you studied law,
Yes.
didn't you? And then
Yes.
you went off to the USA, didn't you, straight after
I
you
did.
graduated?
Yes.
And had some adventures. And you met a very old man in Chinatown in San Francisco.
Yes.
And does that remain a sort of significant moment for you?
A lot of significant, when you're writing a memoir, a lot of significant moments come to your mind when you start writing them, and a lot of them turn out not to be so significant to at least to the arc of the story that you're writing. You have to write a story, but I always remembered that moment because I was 21 and I'd been at university, I'd been reading about Zen and the art of this and that. And I just finished Jack Kerouac's book on Dharma bums. And I was 21 and I was in San Francisco and just sort of soaking up certain ideas that I had about San Francisco. And there's an old Chinese man in one of the full moon festivals. He did just take me in, and I just looked at him and he just asked me how old I was, and I said 21, and he said, such a long way to go, such a long way to go. And I was quite taken back because I thought, I'm 21, I've arrived.
Yes.
I'm 21, what's going on? But
yeah.
And it was one of those moments, and there's not many other in life, where something happens to you and you realize that it like hits you on, it strikes a note, or bell is struck at a deeper level. Like, I don't really know what he meant, but to me it meant there's a lot more to be unfolded in this life. And I found that incredibly exciting, that notion that, I was stuffed full of 18 years of education. I had a law degree from Oxford. I didn't really know anything. This is just such a long way to go. So that really did stay with me. That was I had to keep that memory in. Yeah.
So then, back in the real world, you were wondering what to do, whether to be a lawyer or go on and become a solicitor or a lawyer of some sort.
In the real world, I was just depressed. Actually,
you were really depressed.
Well, not really depressed, but I kind of had all this education. I got back home and I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to. I was on the one hand not confident enough to say work for Amnesty International or do something like really kind of pioneering and exciting. And on the other hand, I thought my mum saying, this is all a load of rubbish, and careers. I sort of looked at them all and thought, that's a load of it doesn't go anywhere. So I had that young man's clarity, which is partly true and partly kind of not true. So I just went to the pub, quite a lot. Just went on, did some silly, sort of jobs that you do when you don't know what else you're doing. Yeah. So it was. Yeah.
And you do describe those sort of jobs and some of your experiences in those offices.
Yes.
As quite amusing, if you like to look at those up. But then you applied for this postgraduate journalism course. And you also were sharing a flat or something, weren't you, with someone, and you used to go jogging together? And then you
Well,
jogged
yeah,
past
that's
the
the story. So
LBC.
this is the story that I wanted to write. Really, was in a way what I'm trying to do in the book as a whole. And it took me quite a long time to write this book, but just to kind of get to it. But I wanted to write a story of somebody who came from the origins that I came from, which was, you know, a reasonable, a good society, a kind of a good education, middle class, but no problems really in that sense. But for which then, you know, I had this meeting. I jogged past the London Buddhist Centre one day and had this meeting with this other thing that I'd never come to expect in my upbringing. Didn't seem to be predicated by any of my education. It wasn't something that I had been looking for in an obvious way. I think that's the same with so many people. You come across this thing and you're given this vision or this imagination or Dharma or whatever you want to call it, but it uplifts your mind to consider something that you haven't considered before. And this happened going into the London Buddhist Centre probably on a Dharma night like this, or you know, and hearing these teachings, seeing these people going on retreat. You know, it didn't happen in a moment, but over the course of a few months, it sort of was in this whole new world that had opened up. And in a way, what I wanted to do in the book was to sort of show at least, you know, that moment, which is so familiar to so many of us who've, you know, had that experience, because the story goes on from there.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So you had this uplifting sort of experience when you started being a regular at the centre.
Yes.
Can you just tell us about that time when you were putting the cushions out and?
Well, yeah, I
just briefly.
Yeah, well, I've done a lot of cushion putting out in my life. I've done rather too much, actually. I think I must have put out the cushions for my Triratna about 100,000 times by now. But when I was, that's for long training, I tell you, putting out cushions for Jnanavatra in my Triratna classes. But I went to the, and I mistakenly understood that Sangharakshita was leading the class, because somebody said, that's what I thought they said. And I was to go and push out the cushions for him. And I was quaking going in there, putting out the cushions. And I'd never seen Sangharakshita, even though he lived upstairs. And I put out the cushions, but this character was half asleep at the back of the room. It wasn't Sangharakshita, it was Sangharatna. Which I anyway, you know, I tell the story because I wanted to tell the story of, anyway, you've seen it in the book.
Yeah. So the next thing you did was that you really got into things at the Buddhist Centre, didn't you? But you did then at London, but then you did come to Cambridge a couple of months.
Yes.
But decided, I think, that you didn't much like working in a warehouse of trinkets. That's his
words. So, you know, sorry. No, it wasn't that. It was my girlfriend, wasn't that?
Oh, it's because your girlfriend.
Well, you know, I just fallen in love, and suddenly I was in a warehouse with 100 guys mainly. And I was just miserable, you know, and I thought, God, is this what I have to do to be a Dharma practitioner? Oh, God. You know, and it was that sense of heart sinking. And yet, like, you know, I'd been living in Sheffield before, and because I did journalism there, and I was just really in love with the Dharma. I was really in love with what these people were doing, you know. So I was in love with it. And then I wanted to, as we're sort of teaching Triratna, then you need to throw yourself in and try and make your whole life a reflection of this, somehow a reflection of this higher thing that you've kind of discerned. So that was what was on offer, you know. It was either work in the Windhorse in Sheffield or have a go at Cambridge. And then I had a go at Friends Organic in Friends Foods in London. And I just didn't want to do it. You know, I cried with relief when somebody actually said that you don't actually have to do that. It's not sort of compulsory. The order member gave me an out there. So you know, I worked as a journalist then and lived at the London Buddhist Centre. But I suppose what I, you know, just sort of to see the time is sort of moving on a little bit, but you know, I then got involved. I lived in the community for 6 years, in both communities at the London Buddhist Centre at that time. And, you know, I loved it. When I was thinking about it earlier today, I was just remembering, because I knew Prasanna Vera was going to be here, and we'd sit up the top of the London Buddhist Centre in our little sweaty shrine room at the top. You'd hear the London traffic and everything going on around you, because it was just right in the roof. And it did seem like you were in a different time zone to the rest of London. You were sort of in a more circular time when you move into a community. It solved so many of those questions that I had, which were to do with what I'm going to do with my life, who am I, what career am I going to do, you know, am I this, am I that? That could be abated somewhat when I was in the community with terrific people, listening to Dharma talks, going on retreats. It kind of abated those questions, but those questions never really went away. They just came back. You know, my old questions about all of that were still alive. So I ended up, you know, after a few years, feeling a conflict, a big conflict, whereas, you know, that both I really love what I'm doing and I really don't want to do it. That kind of, and I really feel deep down I've got to do something else and this is not right. Or it took me a long time to get to that clarity, but it was just felt as a conflict, which made me a bit miserable. And then of course I inflicted that inner unease on other people in terms of personal relationships and being a bit grumpy.
Peevish.
Somebody called me peevish. I don't think it was Prasanna Vera. He called me something.
He called you something.
It might. Well, no, I've got that. I've still got some of the ordination reports that were written. No, it wasn't you who said that. But that kind of, well, I had that kind of thing where I was, you know, I wanted to knock things down with my intellect. So if I wanted to be right, you know, I wanted to, you know, and if I felt threatened, I would just still do this to somebody, you know, I still haven't got cracked this one, but, you know, feel threatened, let's go for this point, this point, this point,
and win the argument.
Win the argument, it's the lawyers.
Like lawyers do.
Like lawyers want to do, it doesn't make them very popular. People don't like it.
And what about the time that Sangharajta came to dinner then? And
which one? So there were several, weren't there?
One.
Shall I read the scoop?
Yeah,
let's read the scoop.
scoop.
Why not? I'll read the scoop. This isn't me. I did have a bit of a thing with argument with him at one point, but not. Anyway, this isn't that. Where is it?
You've got the page.
Oh yes, 134. So this is a time when I was living at the Nava Samaya, yes. And this is the first time I actually met Bhante. When Bhante came into the community dining room, spot on time, we all stood up and I felt an urge to bow, which I held in check. I should say at this time I was working at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court, and I was bowing to the judges. Every time you enter a court building, you have to bow to the judge. And I was sort of bowing to the Buddha in the morning in the shrine room, and now I'm bowing to Bhante. There's a lot of bowing going on in my life at this stage. The embarrassing reflex came instinctively. It wasn't like bowing to a Buddha statue or the judiciary just because everybody else does. He was a medium-sized man, a little portly, wearing a grey jumper. There was nothing that unusual. A rather large straight nose and thin lips on which played the trace of a smile. None of the beads and mysticism implied by the term guru, which was a term he said he didn't like. He said gurus who make claims to enlightenment tend to suck in the most credulous. Bhante was on a diet, regulating his carbs to protein ratio, which basically meant having more tofu. He was ushered to his chair. I squeezed in next to him, keeping my elbows in when reaching for the condiments, Engavita, tahini, soy sauce, watching Bhante at the corner of my eye. His movements were minimal and stately. He chewed slowly. He didn't do much with his facial expressions, no laughs or reassuring smiles and glances. We ate in silence, holding back our usual ping pong of banter. Before dessert, someone asked how things were going at the gift shop. Before dessert, Bhante asked how things were going at the gift shop and had anyone been to see anything interesting lately. One by one, my community fellows disclosed previously undisclosed tastes for opera, Chopin, Schopenhauer's philosophy and some remarkable insights gleaned at the latest Caravaggio retrospective. No one mentioned how he'd recently wheeled out the communal telly to watch the FA Cup. In reply, Bante, unhurried and steady of speech, touched on Plato, Renaissance literature, modern and ancient poetry, painting and current affairs. We were in the company of a truly great conversationalist. It was wasted on us. We were never going to read the commentaries on Thucydides to which he directed our attention. Buddhism was hardly mentioned. Dessert was a lemon cake made by someone's mum, and I think it was your mum, but I'm going to come back to that. Although Bante looked ordinary, he clearly wasn't. The Buddha described a true monk as someone mindful enough to be aware of what his hands and feet are doing all the time. Bante didn't flap about like most people. He was bizarre in a neat and normal way, but I didn't agree with the guy who insisted afterwards that Bante had seen through to his innermost being. Bante had inquired what the guy did for a living, that was all. And what do you do for a living, he asked me. I'm a journalist, I said, thinking nervously about the Guardian article. They were not too polite about Bante around that time in the Guardian. We'd better watch what we say, huh? He said, smiling, his big eyes flashing warmth and humor. Huh was a verbal tick, a slightly inflected upbeat at the end of a sentence, not quite enough when written in print to merit an exclamation mark. His accent, like a lot else about him, was hard to locate, the school teacherly diction, but softer, more musical, with emphasis on odd parts of the sentence. I could imagine him reading Little Red Riding Hood and doing the scary bits really well. David got his first scoop today, Bante, someone mentioned. And what, may we ask, was the scoop? Bante asked. I explained the day before I'd been at an inquest about a Harrow schoolboy who got drunk on his father's tequila and fell out of the window to his death 5 stories below. There were no other journalists in court, so my copy was taken up by the Daily Telegraph. Oh yes, I read that, Bante said. You read the Daily Telegraph? I asked, astounded. I have to say, I did wonder why it was his parents hadn't gone to the trouble of getting a more secure drinks cabinet, huh? He was spot on. The sub-editor had cut out the coroner's remarks about the parents not putting locks on the cabinet, given their son had raided it before. How did Bante find time to wade through the Daily Telegraph, let alone remember a story which got a few column inches on page 8? I thought he was supposed to spend the day meditating and running a worldwide Buddhist movement, whatever that entails. I'd totally trumped the other guys with their operatic tastes. While I'd been sitting on the tube that morning reading Bante, he'd been sitting at home reading me. I polished off my lemon cake, trying not to look too smug. Before he left, he named our community Nava Samaya, which meant new bond. We dedicated our efforts to the happiness of all beings with a short ceremony. I can't remember if it involved any more bowing, but it probably did. Afterwards, as Bante stood by the window posing for a photograph, I noticed a strange white light emanating from the crown of his head. I blinked in disbelief at what I was seeing. He moved slightly to reveal the aircraft warning light flashing on top of Canary Wharf.
Yes, very good. So these conflicts then that
Yes.
you experienced, what happened after that then?
They went round and round, you know, they were sapping my energy really, and as I said, I felt, you know, quite miserable. I remember sort of feeling that after, you know, in my late 20s, I devoted quite a lot, well, all of my 20s really, to this path, and I thought I'm a more miserable creature now than I was when I started, and isn't this supposed to be going differently? All the other people seem to have the spiritual values, and they're getting the spirit, you know, the inner riches of spiritual wealth, which I projected onto other people. They've all got that, but I haven't. I'm duff. I haven't got that for some reason. I'm not quite there.
And didn't Ratnagosha make a suggestion to you?
Many people made suggestions.
Oh yeah, but what
was his?
He suggested that you got a girlfriend.
Yes, he often said that. Yes, yes. I said, look, I'm trying, you know, but you know, the Buddhist parties were naff, you know, that we went to.
Yeah.
You know.
And didn't some woman say to you, well, after all, you know, you haven't got really that much to offer, sort of thing? And type
Well,
of thing?
yeah.
Given that, well, no, not personally.
No, well,
but
no,
given,
it was
given
one
what
of my
you were
non-Buddhist friends. She said,
Yeah.
look, you're earning 10,000 quid a year and you sound really proud of it, but and you're telling us you need to ask every time you need a new pair of shoes. It's not very attractive, she said to a woman.
Yeah.
That was her appraisal.
Yeah.
I took the point.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't, but this was the conflicts that I found myself in, and and lots of board members will listen to me very helpfully, and I got into some personal difficulties with some people, some close people like Jnana Vacha and Maitreya Bandhu, but others would just say, well, I remember Padma Vedra, he said at one point, we've got to think the unthinkable, in a way. I had to give myself permission to say, I'm not going to do this. I'm not. So I stopped asking for ordination and I left the community.
And you had got a girlfriend.
I did,
then,
yes. No, yeah,
And then you went off traveling.
Yeah, I sort of, well, I guess I gave myself permission to leave, and I think that's an important thing as well. That is a moment when you have to change a bit. I never really sort of rejected in my heart something that I had found. I never really sort of. But this was, of course, the whole order. This was around 2003, 4, and the whole movement was going through a kind of crisis of confidence. So there were lots of people I could see around me, lots of people I looked up to who were also asking the question, having practiced Dharma for many years, what has this brought me? What has this done? Is this really what I thought it was? Now, I hadn't given my whole life to the Dharma like some people at that stage. I was still quite young. So I was watching all that unfold. And criticisms of Bhante, criticisms of all these kinds of things were going on. So it was a painful time, and I felt like I was betraying something that I'd been given that was deep. And of course, it wasn't really a betrayal, but it felt like a betrayal. And I think the problem that I was facing was that I had identified this thing of great value, which I'd found. I'd identified it with a particular set of conditions and practices, like it had to be at the London Buddhist Centre or somewhere near it. And I had to do these things, even though I could intellectually tell myself that can't be the case. That's totally ridiculous to think like that. Nonetheless, you are involved with real people in real particular circumstances, which is necessary. And it means that it's painful when you do sort of break away and want to do different things and find yourself in some other way. And I'm sure that happens to most of us in some way or other, that I had to leave, and I
went to come back again, sort of thing.
Yeah,
in your own way.
Yeah, I was a bit too dependent financially on the Buddhist Centre and emotionally on some people, and I needed to wriggle free of that in order to feel something else.
Which you did do, and you then moved out of the community.
Well, I became a lawyer. I did the last thing that I thought I would do. I ended up having, that became a path that I then thought I would do that. So I was sort of backtracking and having to eat my words about law.
But it did then bring you back to deciding that you did want to become ordained.
Yes, slowly. So for another 5 or 6 years, I kept in touch. My partner, my wife, is incredibly supportive. She's a Buddhist with another Buddhist tradition, the Thai forest tradition, and in a way, she was a perfect person to sort of hold and value that which I couldn't always value. Helped me to do that. And Jnana Vacha was, great, because even though we'd had difficulties, we kind of spent a long time, years, actually doing a kind of retrusting of each other again, and same with some other people, and that sort of, it just took a long time. It wasn't easy. It wasn't a very pleasant process. And I, all the sort of conflicts, I don't know whether I can say it's sort of resolved all conflicts. We tend to we have this model, don't we, of integration in Triratna, where you sort of, and that's a great model, but it may be also easy to misunderstand that model as well. It's like there was just a moment when it was a moment, actually. It was on holiday one time, but when I sort of realized that I just needed to sort of step into this current that had taken me to that point. I just needed to trust it and not try to resolve it, to say, look, in this life, I've come across this Dharma. It's been presented to me by Sangharakshita through all these other men and women who've taught me. I have a sense of it. The order's not a perfect order. It's a disaster in lots of different facets of it, or whatever. But it's amazing as well. So in this life, that's what I've come across. I need to sort of just flow along with that. And what's the problem? What the hell is the problem? I'm making a big problem out of this. This whole thing about being ordained. Joanna was amazing, you know, in that respect.
Didn't she tell you that you're just the misery guts?
Well, you know what it's like.
know,
if you have a partner, they're the ones who can deliver the proper blows at the right point, you know. Like,
and it sounds like that was all very, you know, helpful to actually bring you to that point where you.
Yeah, I mean, I think at one point I realized I have the freedom to go around doubting and being miserable my whole life. Ultimately, I could do that. No one can actually stop me. But is it really worth doing it? You know, just like chill out. Doesn't matter. Get ordained. It's not really the end of the world, is it? Whether, I mean, the universe doesn't stand or fall on whether I'm ordained or not. Just go, you know, and go with it. And so then I just did, you know, I just thought I'll do that, and I felt very happy.
That's great, isn't it? And I think, you know, we need to sort of stop to give folk a few minutes to come in and ask things. But I just noticed here that what I wrote down after you'd become ordained, you said my name had slipped into my body as easily as a bird finds its nest. And I think that's just a lovely, you know, a lovely expression to show how it meant a lot to you.
Ratnagoshi gave me my name, and you know, I had to sort of, it went through me, and I had to sort of bring it back and sort of look at it and see what it really was. It's
so lovely. And then another thing that you say towards the end is the two-handed version of me might have been less likable and less happy.
Well, that was what Maitreya Bandhu said, and Joanna had said the same thing, you know, like, you know, maybe it was a good thing, you know, and
So the sound of one hand.
The sound of one hand,
And you now have Joanna in your life, she's your wife, and you've also got someone else entering your life.
Well, he's already made an entry, actually.
Do you want to say about him?
We have a little boy now who's just adopting. He's been with us for 6-7 months, and we're officially adopting him tomorrow. So,
and he's 4 years old, called Thomas.
Thomas, yes, he's a lovely little boy.
Well, thank you for all of this, Satyadasa, and I think we should hand over and see if there's anyone from the floor who'd
Thank
like
you, Kamalamati. Thank you.
Anything.
I've got a quick question. So you're still a relatively young man. So you've got hopefully lots of life to come.
Yes.
This covers a
chunk
of it. Do you envisage another?
My joke is that when I'm 80, I'm going to write a book called On the Other Hand. But no, I'm not going to write another memoir in a hurry. They're hard work to write. They kind of, you have to go down right into the kind of deeper web of connections, and you know, that's the wonderful thing about it's a memoir, isn't it? So it's not an autobiography. It's of a particular memoir of the journey from birth to second birth, ordination, and the wonderful thing about having given that a lot of time is that you find all these connections through the writing process. Just finding the things that. It's quite a delicate and long process, but it's been lovely because so many people have sort of got touch points. And one of the wonderful things about writing a memoir within a community like this is that there's so much shared experience. And somehow my life is the way that I've tried to sort of allow people to see in. It's a bit like what you're saying about your mother, you know, I've tried to allow people to see into a life, just my life, but walk along with it and of course relate to it. And I don't think I'll be writing another memoir. I might like to write something else, but yes.
Thank you. That was a pleasure.
Thank
I
you.
wanted to ask you, I've got 2 mini questions from round. First is, have you recorded an audio version?
I'm going to try and do that. I'm going to try and do that. Yeah.
Please do.
Thank you.
I just think you're so articulate, and the kind of the way you weave words is pretty magic.
Thank you.
And I think there's so many people that like listening. It's really nice to listen to the actual person.
Yeah. Well, I do plan to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. The second mini question is, it seems to me like there's often statues of the Buddha using one hand.
Oh, yes.
And I just wondered if that ever came up for you, or if there's any correlation for you, or you ever noticed that?
I didn't notice that. You know, I called the book The Sound of One Hand. Obviously, it's a reference to the koan, isn't it? The famous. You say it's a famous koan. What is the sound? Right. So it's the sound. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Which is apparently a kind of famous Zen koan. I don't know whether anybody uses koans. They're questions that the Zen master would pose to the student, or in order to force them to answer from a different level at which the question is set, because the question doesn't really mean anything. So the question doesn't mean anything. It's an unanswerable question. That was where I thought of the hand being an unanswerable question as well, that kind of forces something that forces another type of response. But in terms of Buddhas having one hand, no, I hadn't thought of that. No. Yes.
So you've clearly deliberated a lot about your career choices in life,
Yes.
and given a great deal of thought about why you're doing certain things. So I wonder whether you could talk a bit about what made you arrive in your current position at Eton.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to egg that up too much. I go to Eton once a week and teach some boys who do a Buddhist faith class for boys who are either Buddhist or interested in Buddhism. And I have a small law practice, which I'm not a solicitor, I'm a non-practicing solicitor. And I did that because I could do that, and it was a reasonable way of making a living, and it brings me into contact with some lovely people, and there's a Sangha, and everyone needs documents. So that's how I arrived at that choice. It wasn't a career choice in the sense that I did actually at one point, I was worked in environmental law, and that was what I really wanted to do, but I was so miserable doing it that I thought I'd just leave it to somebody else to save the world in that respect. I can't, it was like, it was so ambitious, full of very ambitious, very bright people, and you had to work so long hours that it was an NGO, and I couldn't do it. So I've been lucky, with my work and money aspect. Yeah, it's partly just not like, I think what happened, when I was ordained is what Ratna Gosha said, that this is you, Satyadasa. Okay, you can do this in life, you can do that in life, you can have all kinds of thoughts about what you want to do. That's all fine in a way. He's very open, Ratna Gosha, so just encourages me just to do, but you're given, when you're given a name and you're given this is what you're sort of basically trying to do. Of course, that begs a lot of questions, and it's really not an easy thing to do, to live up to that, what that means, and you could talk about that a lot more. But that really helped me, because we do need an identity, don't we? We do need something. So I think that sort of took the weight. So I think if I try to, somebody says, "What am I doing now?" I say, "I'm a trustee at the London Buddhist Centre." That's what I do, and the rest is just other stuff. Now I say I'm a writer. That sounds a lot more sort of sexy. So that one probably. Yeah, what am I? That whole career thing, but I haven't solved that in the sense I still feel, ambitious. I want to do other things in my life. Yeah.
Quick question on a similar kind of area. So it sounds like you eventually chose some pattern to be something eventually. I was wondering, when you were younger, you did actually choose to study law.
Yes.
What was it that made you choose law? It sounds like you could have done anything, so there must have been something that sparked your interest. What's the reason behind?
I wanted to get into Oxford, and somebody said that I probably would be quite able to get in to do law. And laws are quite a clever sort of subject, and I thought, oh, I'm quite clever. I would have liked to have studied English actually, but I didn't have the confidence. And I thought, like 3 of my friends were really good at English and they were applying to Oxford. So there were no way that 4 of us were going to get in to study English. I always hung out with the English students when I went to college because I just wanted to do what they would do. So I just, it was okay. It was fine to study law, and I don't regret that at all. Although I've always struggled with the kind of mind that you need to be a lawyer it's very heavy. It's very, and I'm not motivated enough to actually want to do it, really.
Okay, I just wondering what was the reason?
Yeah, when you're 16, 17, when I was I must have had discussions with somebody about this, but I can barely remember how the idea of law emerged. I think it was also the idea that I could do something like, work for a human rights barrister firm or something like that. But
So save the world and earn a lot of money.
Yeah, and learn, that's it. You've got it there. You could be very, very comfortably off and be doing something terribly ennobling.
Yeah.
And that was a real, thing, but it was a very young thing. And when it came to it, I didn't have the skills or the drive to actually try to get into one of these positions. I didn't have that in me.
Well, because you've got the Dharma anyway, by then, once you've got the Dharma, I suppose you wouldn't have been, well, you'd had to have changed what you did, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
It's interesting that you describe yourself as a trustee at the London Buddhist Centre first.
Well, I just think that's a more complete explanation of what I'm trying to do overall with my life,
We've got a question.
Question.
So there was obviously grit in your own life.
Yes.
Going through the challenge.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of the metaphor of the grit in the oyster that creates the pearl. And then you subjected yourself to conflict with all these great people around you, and there was a lot of grit there. And then eventually the pearl emerged. You said that, what's the problem? Just do the ordination thing.
Yes.
No problem. And so that seems to be your latest pearl. Do you think that you'll be seeking more grit down the line?
More grit down the line? I do, yeah, I do. I've written this book now, and I've kind of sort of summed up my life, and I feel a strange sense of having done that, and it's sort of gone. It's sort of like it's a product of having thought about it so much. I've kind of rid myself of a lot of the past, and yeah, I expect there's well, I mean, I'm just becoming a father. How do you practice when you're
That's
a
pretty
father?
gritty.
I mean, what does that even mean? Do you have to throw out a lot of ideas that you have? I certainly feel like I have to throw out a lot of expectations or ideas. How does and then of course real problems like getting older emerge. Real sense of the actual things that Buddhism is presumably about, like death and decay and stuff like that. And actually, and like having one hand, will become a problem when I get older. Maybe I start thinking, oh yeah, actually all the practical problems might be at the other end of my life if I get that far, because I could get arthritis in this hand, then I'd be stuffed. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really hard thing to keep engaged with something that we call Dharma practice over decades. I mean, because we change, don't we? Especially if you started off young like I did, you've got your whole life to sort of unfold all the things in your, that kind of naturally just occur to everybody. And at each stage, I guess the different challenges emerge. Just trying to live an ordinary creative life where you sort of have some sense of love for what you're doing and you keep some creative juice in your life, that precious thing is a really, I find it a major struggle. I mean, writing the book gave me that thread for quite a long time, but to keep that thread alive, it's hard, isn't it? Yeah.
Good, thank you. Look, we've gone over time and so I think I'd really just like us to all appreciate this lovely presentation of, from Satyadasa. It's been fantastic having you.
Thank you,
here.
Kamalamati.
Really
Thank you for
lovely.
inviting me.
Such a pleasure. And in the foyer, we have some copies of the book, and Satyadasa will sign if you'd like to buy them. Buy them for your friends as well, of course.
And your mum.
And your mum.
And your mum, yeah.
Mum's a great market.
Yeah, anyone who's been asking you what this is all about, you know, this weird thing we belong to, this Triratna thing, you know, this is a very good way in for people to get a bit of understanding of what it is, what goes on. Yeah, so we'll go for tea. Thank you.
Thank you.